All right, so now we need to start talking about the coming of the American Civil War and Texas's role within that conflict. For starters, let's talk about both northern and southern positions on slavery. Southerners felt as though they were increasingly hemmed in or cornered by northern machinations to try to limit and then eliminate slavery. Not the least of which were growing abolitionist attacks on the character of Southerners. The argument essentially went that if slavery is evil, slave owners are evil, and those that tolerate slavery are evil. Well, nobody likes being called evil, and so pretty soon Southerners are growing very defensive. Northerners, on the other hand, feel as though the slave power of the South has too much influence over national politics. And they're busy trying to figure out how to first contain slavery, and then once it is contained, no longer able to expand, perhaps it could be slowly but surely strangled out. Especially if you have both the legislative branch and the executive branch working in concert to essentially affect laws and regulations in every area where the federal government has jurisdiction over states. Well, then this makes the Southerners believe that, well, this idea of regulatory powers is actually an overreach on the part of the federal government. See, what this northern plan entailed was that anywhere federal authority could be applied, it would be applied to curtail slavery. So this includes things like territorial governments, the transportation of slaves between states on the high seas, etc. So let's say you're a slave owner in Louisiana, you want to buy some slaves in, say, Maryland. You're going to have to haul those slaves overland, which will be extensively more expensive than instead of putting them on a boat, because this federal authority regulates commerce on the high seas. So they may just make slave transportation on the high seas illegal. This is the long game. This is the long game that the Northerners and the anti-slave faction within the United States is really about. So here's the plan. You already have a majority Northern representation both in the Senate and in the House. So what you're missing now is the executive branch. If Northerners can control the executive branch and the legislative branch, then all of a sudden you can have presidential dictates that are then sustained by law. Well, once that construct is put into place, pretty soon slavery will become increasingly expensive to operate. Not only that, there would be an inclination, especially amongst the border states, to abandon slavery. They're the ones where slavery exists the weakest. They're the ones that have most common intercourse with free states. So if you lost the border states, then you might actually gain momentum toward a constitutional amendment that would outlaw slavery, with the Southern voices essentially just overruled. The South's conundrum then, the South's reaction to all this, is that, if the South loses the executive branch, like it's already lost the legislative branch, that they won't be able to oppose this scheme. Places like Kentucky and Delaware and Maryland and Missouri would probably, in fact, in the next decade or so, abandon slavery. As a result, not only would slavery be heading towards extinction, but in the meantime, it would be rendered so economically unviable as a labor system that there would be kind of a chain reaction. In essence, as slavery is contained and even contracted, there would be no outlet for slaves to be moved, for slave increases to be incorporated on other plantations, etc. In essence, slavery would become an economic burden to masters. So, Texas is part of this conversation. In fact, Texas, amongst all the southern states, is perhaps the most driven by the peculiar institution. Slavery is really the reason that Texas is so dynamic in the 1850s. This was the place where slavery would be perfected as an economic system. Also understand that as a result of this, Texans, in the people living in Texas, white Texans, are by and large newcomers. There's very few native Texans. Most of these people come from the Deep South, and they bring with them their cultural institutions, but also their political institutions. The people that end up dominating the Texas government, from the legislature all the way to the Supreme Court, are probably born in the Deep South. And if they're not born in the Deep South, they are certainly heavily influenced by the political theory of the Deep South. Well, what you start seeing by the end of the 1850s is something of a conservative reaction to this changing political landscape within the United States. Most Texans owned 0 slaves. But 1 in 4 did own slaves. And just because you didn't own slaves didn't mean that you didn't aspire to own slaves. So slavery in Texas is a dynamic, accelerating institution. Those that saw this as the route out of the lower classes into the middle and upper classes believed that Northerners should just leave them alone, that they were meddling with something that seemed to be working. If it's not broken, don't fix it, they would argue. Northerners saw this as something that needed to be eliminated, if for no other reasons, out of moral grounds. Well, let's take the pro-slavery folks out of the mix and just talk about people that were sort of bathed in the waters of states' rights. They believed that the North was trying to upend the order that had been put in place by the Constitution, meaning that slavery is a state prerogative, and as such was outside of the scope of any sort of federal intervention, however it may come. So some Texans, like some Southerners, believe that in essence to resist this movement to dismantle slavery was in fact to take up the flag of 1776. They believed that they were actually defending the nation that had been designed by the Constitution. So it's a conservative reaction. Now, mixed up in all of this is Sam Houston. Sam Houston, once again governor of the state of Texas, sees the shipwreck of the Union coming. I mean, he's been in national politics as a senator. Now he's back as governor of the state. He sees nothing good on the horizon. He is not comfortable. Make no mistake, he is not comfortable with the more radical northern positions, which he considered revolutionary. And he also believed that Northerners were in fact sectionalist, that they were essentially forming a sort of an elite section of the country to the detriment of the nation. Sam Houston was a nationalist. All right, you got to understand that. But he also understood that in order to defeat sectionalism, you don't form a counter section. What you do is you appeal to the common nationalism. You support the nation by refusing to let the nation be sundered by faction and sectionalism. This is manifested with his support of the Constitutional Union Party, which is a nationalist party, in the election of 1860. Doesn't gain a whole lot of traction. It does influence the election, but not decisively. In the end, Houston not only feared Northern sectionalism, but he also feared the hotheads in the South. He wasn't necessarily in support of the pro-slavery position, unless by being pro-slavery you mean leaving it alone, which he was content to do. But he did say that if the South seceded, they would be playing in to Northern hands.